Patrick Farrell looked in the rearview mirror and confidently turned the corner in his heavy truck. The man had been on a long trip in the past week. He was sent on it by the trucking company that transported cargo across the country. Patrick dreamed of becoming a driver since his childhood, and despite growing up in an orphanage, he managed to achieve his goal. The man liked the sound of tires on the pavement and the wind pleasantly blowing on his face through the half-opened window of the truck cab. Over the years, Patrick didn't lose his youthful enthusiasm and admired the romance of being on the road just as much as before. It was December, 5 days until the new year. Patrick was in a great mood. It wasn't only due to the upcoming holiday, but also because he was finally going to see his beloved girlfriend, Darcy. They'd been together for over a year now. Wanting to make his girlfriend happy, Patrick bought her an expensive gift. He spent half his salary on it. This will definitely make Darcy change her mind and finally accept my marriage proposal, the man thought, looking at the velvet box, which had the ring with the tiny emerald in it. Wanting to get home as soon as possible, Patrick drove non-stop for several hours in a row. The trucker didn't want to waste time on stops, as it would only keep him away from Darcy longer. Patrick knew that his girlfriend had probably prepared a delicious dinner for him already and was sitting around waiting for him to come home. Finally, the bright lights of Chicago appeared ahead. It was the holiday season, and the metropolis shone with neon lights and festively decorated banners. All the lights and decorations delighted both the tourists and the locals. Patrick left his truck in the parking lot and hurried to his house. But as soon as the man turned on to the familiar street, he suddenly saw something that made him very anxious. The fact was that despite the late hour, the windows of his house were dark. Where could Darcy have gone at this hour? Patrick thought, opening the front door. As he suspected, his girlfriend wasn't home. There was no delicious dinner and no festive decorations. But the worst part was the note, which Patrick found on the table. He recognized the handwriting, so it was definitely written by Darcy. The woman said in the note that she could no longer live like that and that she was leaving Patrick for another man who loved and appreciated her. Darcy ended the note saying that she had made this decision a long time ago and was simply waiting for the right moment to tell Patrick. There are no words to describe what Patrick felt that moment. The ring box was still in the pocket of his jacket, but he no longer had a girlfriend to give it to. Well, that's one way to celebrate. How could this have happened? Patrick thought with a sad sigh and sank into a chair. Being tired from the long trip and sad from the news, the trucker felt like his life had lost all meaning. Patrick was no longer in the mood to celebrate the holidays. That evening, the trucker stayed up late in the kitchen and only went to bed in the morning when the bottle of drink was almost empty. Trying to find solace in alcohol, Patrick went all out, emptying bottle after bottle. Overwhelmed by his grief, the man even tried to call Darcy repeatedly, but all he ever got was voicemail. Patrick didn't even realize when several days flew by. Unfortunately, the well-being of the depressed trucker had been affected greatly. Soon, Patrick could no longer even look at alcohol, which only aggravated his already deplorable condition. The man realized that the only thing that could help him get out of his depression was to go back to doing what he loved the most. Therefore, having come to his senses and sobered up, Patrick took a bath and decided to go on a long trip the next day after New Year's, which he actually refused to take just 5 days ago. But since the circumstances changed his life, he no longer had anyone holding him back. Sitting in the cab of his truck, Patrick confidently left the parking lot and drove to the construction base located a few miles out of the city. Only back behind the wheel of his time-tested truck did the trucker finally feel confident and comfortable again. Patrick drove fast, darting forward like an arrow, and then he went slower, listening to the strained screech of the brakes. The man turned on the music and turned up the volume to distract himself from his sad thoughts. The truck was immediately filled with sounds of uncomplicated festive composition, which cheered the driver up. Unfortunately, because the man was in such a rush and because of his emotional state, Patrick didn't notice that the fuel tank of his truck was nearly empty. He hadn't traveled for more than 3 miles when he saw the empty fuel tank light come on. Fortunately, the experienced trucker knew that there was going to be a gas station soon, where he could fill up his tank. His memory did not let the man down, and he soon saw a familiar building appear ahead. Patrick parked his truck next to the right pump and headed to the checkout to pay for a full tank of gas. But before the trucker had time to take a couple of steps, the door to the building swung open, and the gas station attendant jumped out with disheveled hair and a wild look. "Hey man, it's so good that you came. Come inside. I need your help," the stranger shouted and waved his hand at the trucker. Patrick glanced at the man with displeasure, but followed him nevertheless. What the driver saw inside shocked him and made him wince. There was a woman lying on the floor near the back room. She was holding her belly with her hands and moaning loudly. It only took a quick glance for Patrick to realize that the woman was pregnant. "How did she get here? And why are you just standing there instead of calling an ambulance?" Stammering at every word, asked the trucker. "I already called them, but they said that it would be a while. They said that they're on their way, but it's already been half an hour, and they still haven't arrived," the man answered resentfully. "So what do you want from me?" Patrick asked, dumbfounded. The attendant turned red in response and said, "Listen, man, I don't know what to do. Maybe you could take her to the hospital or something?" he suggested. Patrick looked at the stranger, then nodded in the affirmative. Meanwhile, the trucker asked the attendant to fill up his tank, while he helped the moaning woman climb into the cab of his truck. At this moment, the woman in labor seemed to have finally noticed Patrick, and looking intently at his face, she asked in surprise, "Kevin? How did you get here, honey?" The trucker was confused, but he decided that the woman had been a bit out of it because of all the pain. She must be imagining things because of the pain. Who's that Kevin? I'm not Kevin. She's probably confused, Patrick thought as he hit the gas. The truck was soon flying along the deserted highway back to the city, where the hospital that Patrick needed was located. All the time that the woman in labor spent in the cab of the truck, she either came to her senses or fell back into painful oblivion. Patrick was only able to calm down after he finally brought the stranger to the hospital. Seeing how the trucker carried the woman inside, the hospital staff mistook him for her husband. However, the woman in labor confidently continued to call Patrick Kevin and asked him to stay in the waiting room. Could she really be having such intense hallucinations? This is the first time I've ever seen something like this, Patrick thought as he went back to his truck. Since the unexpected adventure with the woman in labor took a lot of strength and energy, the trucker decided to return home and postpone his trip until tomorrow. But he couldn't get the thought of this strange woman out of his head. Patrick tossed and turned in bed for a long time until sleep finally overtook him. However, before falling asleep, the man decided that he would definitely go visit the woman at the hospital the next day. Patrick couldn't understand why he felt the need to do it. It was probably the woman's eyes. Looking into them made the man's heart fill with pity and anxiety. Therefore, as soon as the first rays of sunshine appeared outside his window, Patrick got ready and went to the hospital. Seeing him, the nurse on duty smiled happily and immediately gave the trucker the good news. "Congratulations, you have a son." The news made Patrick blush to the very roots of his hair. Then, plucking up his courage, the man asked the nurse to take him to the room of the woman who called him her husband the day before. As it turned out, the stranger's name was Nancy Watkins, and she really thought that Patrick was her husband. But when the trucker showed her his documents, she sighed in surprise and almost fainted. Then, after drinking a glass of water and calming down, Nancy began her story. According to the woman, her husband's name was Kevin, and he looked exactly like Patrick. Only, unlike Patrick, he didn't drive a truck, but was a successful businessman. Unfortunately, Kevin Watkins died 3 months ago on a fishing trip with a colleague. The young businessman fell out of the boat and fell into a swift current, which instantly pulled the man to the bottom. His Patrick, Bill Anderson, insisted that it was exactly what had happened and refused to answer any additional questions about that day. The police had no reason to doubt his words, and it was only Nancy who didn't believe the man's story. This was due to the fact that Bill was an envious person and dreamed of becoming the sole owner of the company, which was founded by Kevin. Nancy knew that her husband's partner didn't invest a dime in the business and appeared at the firm only when it was a successful and stable business. Moreover, Nancy explained that Bill took over his business and all of its assets after Kevin's death. He also tried to harass me, which is why I had to run away from my home, and that's why I ended up at the gas station when I went into labor. I'm really sorry. You look so much like my Kevin that for a moment there, I was sure it was him, Nancy said in a trembling voice. It's okay, you're safe here at the hospital, and so is your baby. And in the meantime, I'll try to find out how it happened that I had a twin brother whom I've never heard of before, Patrick said, radiating confidence. Leaving the hospital, the trucker already knew where he needed to go first. Patrick grew up in an orphanage, and therefore it was there that he needed to get answers first. Of course, the director of the orphanage acted surprised at first, repeating over and over again that he knew nothing about the man's alleged twin brother. But then, unable to withstand the condemnation in the eyes of the former student, Henry Moore gave up. Forgive me, Patrick. I should have told you earlier. The truth is that Kevin got adopted at the age of 2. The family must have had some connections because they didn't do it by the book. I know that I shouldn't have let them separate you, but the adoptive parents were so convincing, the director said in a guilty tone, hinting that he might have been paid off. Thus, Patrick had learned the truth. It turned out that the trucker had a twin brother his entire life, only he knew nothing about him. Patrick was very sorry that he never got a chance to see him and get to know him. This news shocked the man so much that he didn't even remember how he ended up at the company of his deceased brother, where he apparently went to meet the new owner. But when Bill Anderson saw the visitor at the door of his office, who looked exactly like his late partner, he turned white as chalk and pressed back into his chair. No. This can't be happening. I personally pushed you into the water. I watched you drown, the businessman shouted, covering his eyes with his hands. It was clear that Bill Anderson was having a breakdown, which only stopped when the police arrived. The truth was that when he saw Patrick, the cunning businessman was so bewildered that he accidentally confessed to having murdered his partner. For the crime he committed, Bill was now facing time in prison, which would isolate him from society for many, many years. So much had happened to Patrick in so little time that he was feeling dizzy. However, the man realized that he was now responsible for the family of his deceased brother. Therefore, when Nancy was discharged from the hospital, Patrick took her and the newborn baby to his home. Although he did go to the house of his deceased brother first and gathered Nancy's things, as well as photographs of Kevin. The trucker's life was now filled with meaning and hope, which seemed to have been lost forever after Darcy's betrayal. Meanwhile, Nancy was happy to share the house with the man who looked so much like her late husband and had a similar disposition too. About a year after they met, Nancy and Patrick decided to get married. And they shouldn't be condemned for it, because their hearts were filled with love for each other and they simply wanted to become a real family and live happily ever after.